So this is Season 1, Episode 3 of Babylon 5, Born to the Purple. And this is very much a Centauri-centric episode of the show, which is absolutely fine because they're a very interesting race and they are very central to the goings-on in the show. And we start with a bit of dancing. Babylon 5 is quite a broad church, so it has nightclubs as part of its social scene. And we see that Londo is sat enjoying the view when Sinclair and Jakar come up and rather disturb his view. It turns out that he's supposed to be discussing the Euphrates Treaty with them, and of course he hasn't shown up because he's got certain distractions going on. And he asks the gentlemen to sit down so that they don't obscure the view as a new dancer comes on stage. And it turns out that this dancer is actually his girlfriend, called Adira. And he says of her, "Is she not perfection?" Whilst they are toasting females in general, another female joins up who is not quite so lovely, and she's Kodath, and she's Jakar's new aide, which flummoxes him quite a lot because he sat there drinking with the Centauri ambassador. A little bit embarrassing. So they go off together, and after the show we find that Adira has made herself at home in Londo's quarters, so they clearly know each other quite intimately by this stage. And meanwhile, Garibaldi detects an unauthorized transmission on the Gold Channel, and his subplot in this episode basically involves his investigations into these unauthorized transmissions. We then see that everyone else is in the conference center waiting to start negotiations about the Euphrates sector, apart from Londo. And Veer is busy trying to level up on a handheld games device rather than chasing down his boss. Sinclair is not impressed, neither is anyone else, and Talia actually leaves the conference center and Sinclair follows her. So Sinclair explains that these are important discussions from his point of view because they could demonstrate that the station is doing what it's there to do, which is forge peace and alliances between different races. Talia explains that she had to leave because too much emotion is difficult for her to block, especially when she's close up to it. And it's just an indication that as a P5, she does have certain limits. Sinclair very much wants her there because he explains that she's his peeler. She's there to peel away the various lies that both sides will be telling in order to try and get to the heart of the matter and get a deal done. So we cut to Adira and Malari recuperating in bed together, and there's a point here to note about Centauri status. The hair is really important. So the bigger the hair on the males, the more important they are. So it's very much a status symbol for them. Now, with the females, Adira is basically bald, and as I recall, all the Centauri females are bald. Now, she does have a ponytail, and I'm wondering, thinking about it, as to whether or not the longer the ponytail is, the less status they have. So I think the less hair they have, the more status they have. So it's kind of the inverse of the males. I'll come back to that in later episodes. We'll see if that's right or not. There's a slight question mark here of whether or not she's got genuine feelings for Malari, or whether or not she's just trying to exploit his status. It's told quite believably. There just seems to be genuine affection between the two. So we'll see. Londo accuses Veer of being a moon-faced assassin of joy when he calls him for the umpteenth time to say he needs to get his backside to the conference center to discuss the Euphrates Treaty as he's supposed to be doing, given that he's ambassador of the Centauri Republic and minor point. So Londo says he'll be there and can Veer have a cup of hot jala waiting for him, which he does. So there's another comms anomaly, and Garibaldi is discussing with Ivanov on CNC because very few people should have access to the Gold Channel that's being messed with. So he's not prepared to let it lie, and he won't accept that it's just computer error, which is what Ivanov is suggesting. So we know he's like a dog with a bone at this point. He's going to keep looking at it. The negotiations then resume, and we switch to Adira's quarters, where we find a rather delightful gentleman called Trackis waiting for her. It looks like he's escaped from the Thriller video with his sort of red leather jacket. Very, very nice. And we find out now that she's actually a slave, and she's his slave, and he owns her basically, and she's been tasked rather with getting Londo's purple files for him. And Trackers goes on to explain that the purple files are basically Londo's source of power in the Centauri Republic, because they contain dirt on every other major Centauri house, so that if he needs to apply pressure to someone in order to cement his position, he can do so with the purple files. And as a result of that, the Narns will pay rather handsomely for them. And so this is Traxxas' plan, is to get his hands on them. And he gives her a mind probe device so that she can get hold of Laurie's access codes and get the purple files. So she's a little bit nervous when she next meets Londo, understandably. And he gives her a gift of flowers called star laces that glow, and explains that they were grown for her, presumably rather than being imported, which is probably exorbitantly expensive because hydroponic space on Babylon 5 would be at a premium. So it's either that or he's had them shipped in very, very quickly. But either way, there would be quite a lot of cost involved. He also then goes on to give her a brooch, which is a family heirloom. So he's taken the relationship pretty seriously, which obviously is making her even more nervous given what she's been tasked to do. And he says that they're going to go and eat at Fresh Air, which is the finest restaurant in Babylon 5, which I'll talk about in a moment. She's concerned by this because she's worried that being seen with her would damage his reputation, and she's very conscious that in Centauri society that would be damaging for him. But he basically says appearances be damned because he's so in love with her. So Garibaldi then detects another attempt to access Gold Channel, and he launches a program to try and track the source of the transmission, but then he gets blocked by intrusion countermeasures electronics. He gets iced, basically, which doesn't impress him at all, and again just increases his determination to find out what the hell's going on. So we discover why Fresh Air is called Fresh Air at this point, and it turns out that this restaurant is actually on the inside of Babylon 5's skin. So Babylon 5 is what's termed an O'Neill cylinder. So the idea is that it's the internal surface area is where you grow your hydroponics for oxygen and food. You have sort of water features there, big sort of lighting strip down the middle, and that's kind of trying to recreate a fairly natural environment. And between that layer and the outside skin are the actual sort of more operational decks of the station, effectively, and where all the utilities and so on will run through. So obviously it's called Fresh Air because it's literally it's as outside as you can get inside 2,500,000 tons of spinning metal, all alone in the night. So Sinclair is treating Talia to a meal there because for helping in the negotiations, and she notes that she'd never heard so many lies outside of the politics bureau before, and she also notes that Londo's thoughts were rather erotic during the course of the negotiations, and Sinclair points across the dining area, and it says that that's probably why, because Londo and Dira are there enjoying their meal. Garibaldi's gone back to Ivanova about the Gold Channel issue, but she says that she can't help him, having run a scan on the system which declares itself to be free of what we'd call malware. So Garibaldi seems to have hit another dead end. Londo and Adira get back from their meal, and Adira very rapidly spikes Londo's drink to more or less make him unconscious, but not quite. And she uses the mind probe that Trackers gave her to get access to the purple files using his voice as a sort of voice recognition passcode. She doesn't say anything during this time, but we see her successfully access the purple files and transfer them to a crystal storage device. She leaves the heirloom behind. She doesn't take it with her when she goes, and the music sort of indicates that she's very sort of conflicted at this point, and it's quite sort of sad for her. Veer comes in to wake Londo up to try and get him to the negotiations on time, and Londo finds the heirloom and gives him pause for thought, obviously. Adira speaks with her master, and rather than him coming to her quarters, she suggests that they meet on the Zocalo, which is far more crowded, but there's less chance of Londo finding her there and interrupting the handover of the files. Londo then is starting to realise what's going on, and he needs to investigate more. So he encourages Veer to get his feet moist and basically delegates control of the negotiations on the Euphrates sector to him. But he warns him not to give away the homeworld. We then see that Adira has a plan to get off the station. She's asking one of her dancer friends to get a ticket for her, basically, having evaded Trakis. But Trakis is a clever lad, and he actually manipulates Londo by half explaining to Londo what's happened, that he owns Dira, which Londo clearly didn't know, and that takes him back, because basically he's been consorting with a slave, which would be frowned upon in Centauri society, even more so than anything else, perhaps. And so he explains that because he'd be criminally liable himself for the actions of Adira in stealing the files, he wants to resolve the situation himself as well. He uses this opportunity to bug Londo by actually putting a cloaked listening device onto his shoulder. Londo tells him to get out because he's understandably angry and upset because he thinks he's been played, and throws flowers at the wall after he's left. Chikara is infuriated that Veer has been sent to negotiate with him, and so in protest he in turn delegates to Kodath to negotiate on behalf of the Narn regime, and he also tells her not to give away the homeworld in the course of the negotiations. Meanwhile, Londo has discovered the theft of the Purple Files. He's confirmed it, and Sinclair has come to try and find him to get him back to the negotiations, get him back on track. And Londo explains that he needs his help, and he asks for the highest discretion, because if word got out that he'd let these Purple Files out into the wild, his career would be over, and the Republic could suffer as well. So Sinclair says that he will help in return for Londo accepting his compromise on the Euphrates sector, and Londo agrees, and he'll even seal it with a kiss, which Sinclair says that Chikara will be delighted by. So they go back to where the episode began. They go back to the club, and Sinclair manages to bluff the club owner into thinking that he knows someone else in the underworld, effectively, and that he'd like to hire some dancers for a private party. It's not really explained why the club owner doesn't recognise Sinclair as the commander of the space station that he inhabits, but there you go. And one of the dancers is fairly rapidly able to give up her likely location, but unfortunately, of course, the bug on Londo conveys that information to Trakis, who is meeting with the insectoid fixer Nagraph in order to get some heavies to delay Londo and Sinclair, to give him time to get to Adira first. And there's a little bit of gunplay as Sinclair and Londo get ambushed by the heavies. One of them, who looks like a sort of cheap Schwarzenegger knockoff with shiny sunglasses, has loose lips and actually says out loud that they've got the girl so they can stop chasing them now, sort of thing, with Londo and Sinclair actually within listening range. But Londo's already put two and two together. He realises that Trakis has effectively double-crossed him. So they need a new plan. Ivanova tells Garibaldi to go and check out the shots fired. I think presumably those shots that were just fired. But he's got an inkling about something, so he delegates that to his own security team and decides to stay put in his security centre. Sinclair notes that no ships will have left the station, and given what's at stake for Londo, he decides that he'll keep on pushing the boat out for him and comes up with another plan. Meanwhile, Garibaldi is countermeasuring the countermeasures on the Gold Channel the next time it's used without permission, and his icebreaker program succeeds in getting him access into the transmission. And it turns out that Ivanova as the Gremlin. And the reason that she's accessing Gold Channel is that her father is actually dying, and he doesn't have long left. And we established that, as we already knew, her mother is gone as well. And it's also mentioned here that her brother was lost in the war. So effectively, the people that she knows on Babylon 5 will become her family even more so at this point. Can't remember if there's anyone else in her family, but she's lost a lot of people now. Her father says that he is proud of her, but he acknowledges that he didn't show her enough love and asks for forgiveness, which she grants, and then he passes. So both Sinclair and G'Kar now start hatching some plans. G'Kar basically has been offered the purple files by Trakkis, but at the same time Sinclair has had a meeting with Londo and Talia, and Talia isn't very happy about helping them to try and resolve the situation, but she does think that there might be a way for her to help them while still staying within her own cycle rules. So they have a meeting with Trakkis, G'Kar and Talia, and Trakkis is nervous about the telepath being there, understandably, but G'Kar reassures him it's totally normal, because G'Kar does use telepaths himself for negotiations. It's not unusual in business transactions. So Talia explains to Trakkis that she's just there to verify the merchandise, and that whatever else he does, he shouldn't think about anything else, like, for example, where Adira is. And of course, what that very cleverly does is make him immediately sort of bring it to the forefront of his mind, so that she can just pluck out the information without her having to do a deep scan, which would be against her rules. So she then shouts out to Sinclair, who's lurking in the vicinity, and he then calls that into security to go and secure Adira. Trakkis tries to leave, and Londo comes around from another corner and decks him with a rather unconvincing fake punch, and then a kick while he's down, just for good measure, and takes the data crystal off him, securing the purple files, his reputation, and the Centauri Empire, or Republic sometimes. And he takes great joy in explaining that G'Kar has just helped him to save his career and the Empire, and of course G'Kar is once again foiled and storms off in a huff, basically. It's a bit cheesy, it does whiff a little bit, but it's very much in keeping with their relationship. Meanwhile, we then cut back to C&C, where Garibaldi is on the command deck waiting for Ivanova to come onto the deck. And it's just them on the deck at this point. And she asks how his investigation is going, and he explains that it was just a computer error, which is what she originally said it was, and that he doesn't think it'll happen again. And she confirms that no, it won't. So they both know exactly what the crack is. She knows that he's letting her off lightly, and he offers to buy her a drink, and she declines. But just before he leaves, she says that maybe she'll rain check him on it, because she's grieving, and he gets that, but he wanted to reach out to her. So that's an interesting sort of development in their relationship. There's a degree of trust there, which is clearly building. So we then switch back to the departure bay, where Adira is getting ready to go back to her planet Darbo, which I think the Tannoys is in the Aries sector. I'm assuming that the transport is going directly there. And it turns out that Sinclair has persuaded Trakkis, in inverted commas, not necessarily gently, that he should free Adira. And so Londo hands over the documentation that ends her slavery contract, and she leaves the station as a free woman. And they both say to each other that there'll be no more masks, they're just going to be completely straight with each other from this point. But although Londo would like her to stay, and I think she would like to stay as well, she says that the wounds are just sort of too fresh at the moment. Because at the end of the day, she did drug him, and then she stuck a device on his head and accessed his very, very sensitive files. And she just thinks that they both need space, I think, at this point. And she says finally to him, "Goodbye, my ambassador." And that's basically where the episode ends, and we see rather sort of disconsolate Londo heading away from the hangar area. And he said to her earlier in the episode that he's loved and lost before, but I think this was perhaps a more probably the most genuine relationship that he's had to this point from the way that he's been behaving. So there's no Sinclair jumping in a Starviewer in this episode for the first time in this season so far. So it's very much a sort of a self-contained kind of bottle kind of episode, this. It reveals more about the way that the Centauri society works. So they're very much about power plays and families and status and all that sort of good stuff. And that will obviously, play into future episodes. Jakar is still very much Jakar. He'll play anything for any advantage he can get over the Centauri, given half a chance. And Sinclair again is showing his willingness to stick his neck out and go that extra mile in order to try and make sure that the station is achieving its goals. So, all in all, it's quite an interesting episode. It's not sort of hugely action-packed, but it's nice character development. And obviously, we're still in that sort of build-up phase where James is trying to bring in all the characters gradually over time, so we're not kind of overwhelmed. And it's achieving that. So I'm going to leave it there with this one, and I will join you for the next one. Thanks for listening.